The gavel came down at exactly $47,000, and something inside me cracked open like an egg. Not metaphorically, not gently, more like the way a shell splits under sudden, unforgiving pressure. One moment whole, the next moment pieces, the contents of whatever I had been spilling across a table I hadn't agreed to sit at. I stood on that low platform in the back room of the Whitmore Genetics Consortium, dressed in the pale green clinic gown they made all the surrogates wear. And I listened to a number being assigned to me as though I were real estate, as though I were something bought and sold and moved into. I suppose, in that moment, I was. My name is Floyd Grey. I was 26 years old when my brother made the worst and most desperate decision of his life, and somehow managed to make it mine instead. Let me explain how a person ends up standing on a wooden platform in a back room with a number card around his neck, because it is not the kind of story that begins simply. It begins, like most disasters, with love. My brother's love for his wife Elena, who had wanted a child for longer than either of them could properly articulate. Elena had a condition. The doctors had explanations for it that involved terminology I never fully memorized, but the simple version was this: she could not carry a pregnancy. Her body would not hold one. Every attempt had ended in grief so acute that my brother, Marcus, had started to look hollowed out from the inside, like something had been slowly eating him since his wedding day. So Marcus looked for alternatives. And Marcus, being the kind of person who never did anything by half measures, found the most extreme and efficient alternative available to him: the Whitmore Genetics Consortium's private surrogate contract program. For the right price, a surrogate could be contracted to carry an alpha-line child using donated genetic material. The contracts were binding. The compensation was generous. The process was, according to the brochure Marcus had thrust into my hands one evening at dinner, completely above board. What Marcus had not fully read, buried in the fine print of the contract he had already signed on my behalf, using a medical power of attorney I had given him 3 years ago after my car accident, was the auction clause. Surrogate contracts for alpha-line pregnancies, particularly those requiring genetic compatibility assessment, were subject to a matching process that the consortium had apparently rebranded as a compatibility selection event. The language in the brochure called it a curated pairing experience. The language in my head, once Marcus sat across from me at my kitchen table and explained what had happened, was considerably less polished. "You signed me up," I said, very quietly. "Floyd, listen, you signed me up for an auction. It's not, they don't call it that, Marcus." I set down my fork. "What is the exact process by which another person will acquire my surrogate contract?" He was quiet for a long moment. "Competitive bidding." I stared at him for so long that he started to sweat. The thing is, I couldn't even be entirely furious with him. Marcus had been drowning. Elena had been drowning. They were two people clinging to each other in deep water, and they had reached out and grabbed the nearest thing, which happened to be me, and now I was drowning alongside them. That is what family does. That is the terrible, involuntary gravity of loving people. You fall with them, whether or not you agreed to jump. I went to the consultation at the consortium 2 days later. The intake coordinator, a brisk woman named Dr. Harlow, explained the process with the practiced neutrality of someone who had explained it many times. Genetic compatibility screening, a brief physical assessment, a profile compiled from my results, then the selection event, where registered alpha clients would review profiles and bid for the contract that best matched their criteria. The winning bidder would be bound to the contract terms, so would I. "And I can't withdraw?" I asked. "The contract your legal representative signed on your behalf is binding under medical delegation law," Dr. Harlow explained, not unkindly. "However, there is a 24-hour window post-selection during which either party may invoke the compatibility review clause, which would require a face-to-face meeting and mutual confirmation before the contract is finalized." I held on to that like a lifeline. 24 hours. A face-to-face meeting. Mutual confirmation. It wasn't much, But it was something. The selection event took place on a Friday evening. There were 12 of us on the platform at various points throughout the night, filtered through in groups of 3. I was in the third group. We stood under carefully calibrated lighting. Not harsh, not unkind, just deeply clinical. While somewhere beyond the partition wall, registered bidders reviewed our profiles on tablets and entered numbers into a system. I had decided, in the days leading up to this, to feel nothing. It seemed like the most practical approach. I was not going to spiral into existential distress about being commodified by a private genetics firm. I was not going to weep. I was going to stand straight, think about something pleasant, and then go home and open a bottle of wine and call my best friend Delia and let her be furious on my behalf. I stood straight. I thought about my apartment, my bookshelf, the particular quality of afternoon light that came through my living room window in autumn. I did not weep. The gavel came down, $47,000. And that crack, that eggshell fracture. It happened anyway, despite my resolve, because no amount of practical detachment fully prepares you for the moment when a number is assigned to your body. Dr. Karek Yorching. Harlow appeared at my elbow 20 minutes later. Congratulations, Mr. Grey. Your contract has been acquired. By whom? She glanced at her tablet. The winning bidder is registered as Jared Charles. He's a pre-approved alpha client. His file is impressive. I think you'll find the compatibility assessment favorable. The face-to-face meeting has been scheduled for tomorrow morning, 10 o'clock. I nodded. And the mutual confirmation clause still applies, she confirmed. You both need to sign before the contract is finalized. I went home. I opened the wine. I called Delia, who was appropriately and extensively furious. I did not sleep well. There is something deeply strange about knowing that somewhere across the city a person you have never met knows what you look like, knows your genetic profile, knows the specific measurements the consortium had cataloged for their records, and has decided to pay $47,000 for the privilege of having a child with your DNA partially involved. It produces a quality of sleeplessness that is not quite anxiety and not quite anticipation, something in between, like a frequency you can feel in your teeth. I got up at 6, made coffee, stood at my window, and watched the city do its morning things, delivery trucks and dog walkers, and a woman across the street who did yoga on her balcony every morning with what I'd privately considered an unreasonable amount of grace. I thought about the name, Jared Charles. It told me nothing. It could belong to anyone. I dressed carefully, not because I was trying to impress anyone. The contract was already signed. The bidding was already done. This meeting was technically just a formality before final confirmation, but because I have always felt that the way you present yourself to a difficult situation matters, it is a form of armor, a way of walking into uncertainty and saying, I am still a person with agency. I still made choices about my collar and my shoes, and that means something. I wore navy trousers, a white shirt, a gray jacket that my mother had given me 2 Christmases ago, and that I wore whenever I needed to feel like an adult. I looked at myself in the mirror, and I looked like someone who was fine. Good enough. The consortium's consultation suite was a different space from the back room where the selection event had taken place. It was designed to feel warmer, softer lighting, actual plants, chairs upholstered in something that wasn't aggressively sterile. Dr. C. Harlow greeted me at reception and led me to a room with a round table and a window that looked out onto a small internal courtyard. Mr. Charles has been informed of the meeting time, she said. He should arrive within the next few minutes. Can I get you anything? Water? Coffee? Coffee, I said, because I had been awake since 6 and the wine had not been as helpful as I had hoped. She left. I sat. The courtyard outside the window had a small fountain that was doing something decorative with water, and I watched it because watching water do things is significantly more soothing than watching a door. The door opened. I turned, and Jared Charles walked in and stopped and fell completely, utterly silent. The silence lasted long enough that I had time to take him in properly. He was tall, the kind of tall that registers before anything else. that reorganizes a room simply by occupying it. Dark hair, cut neatly, with a slight tendency toward disarray at the front that suggested it did this on its own rather than by design. Strong jaw, clean-shaven, eyes that were a particular shade of dark gray-green that I had no immediate reference for. He was wearing a charcoal suit and a shirt the color of deep water, and the overall effect was of someone who was used to being looked at and had stopped needing to think about it. He was staring at me. Not in a rude way, not even in an uncomfortable way particularly, more as though something had interrupted a process he had been running internally, and he needed a moment to restart it. I raised an eyebrow. "Mr. Charles?" Something moved through his expression, a flicker of something that resolved quickly into composure. "Yes." He crossed to the table, pulled out the chair across from me, and sat. And for a moment he just looked at me with those gray-green eyes as though I were a problem he was trying to solve. "I apologize. You're not. I had a mental image. You're different from it." "Different how?" A pause. "More real," he said finally, which was such an odd thing to say that I didn't quite know what to do with it. "I assure you I've been real the whole time," I replied. "I was real on the platform too, for what it's worth." Something crossed his face that wasn't quite a wince. "I know. This whole process is something I've had significant reservations about. The mechanism of it." He pressed 2 fingers briefly to his temple, then lowered his hand. "I want to explain something to you, Mr. Grey, before we discuss anything else." "Floyd," I said, "if we're apparently going to be involved in something this personal, you may as well use my first name." "Floyd," he said, and something about the way he said it was careful, like he was making sure he got the weight of it right. "I'm Jared." A pause. "I want you to know that I didn't. I wasn't comfortable with the format of this process, the selection event. I want to be clear that I do not think of you as something I purchased." I studied him. "And yet you participated in the auction." "Yes." He didn't flinch from it. "Because I was told it was the only mechanism available for this program, and because I have reasons, significant reasons, for needing this arrangement. That doesn't make me comfortable with the method. And I'm aware that the discomfort of the method falls primarily on you, not on me, which makes my discomfort rather beside the point." I was quiet for a moment. Outside, the fountain continued its decorative water activities. I thought about the 24-hour clause. I thought about the way he had walked through the door and gone silent. "What are your reasons," I asked, "for needing this arrangement?" He was quiet for a beat. "My family has a line of biological succession that matters to them considerably more than it matters to me. I am the last in it. There are pressures. The consortium's Alpha Line program was presented to me as a way to meet those obligations without requiring a relationship I'm not in a position to have." "Why aren't you in a position to have one?" He met my eyes directly. "Because the relationships I'm capable of wanting are not the kind that produce biological children through conventional means." It took me a second. Then I understood, and something shifted in the architecture of this entire situation. "You're gay," I said. "Yes," he said. "And the consortium's program, specifically the Alpha Line surrogate contract, was presented as a solution. A third party carries the child. My family's requirements are met. I don't have to enter a marriage I don't want." I looked at him for a long moment. "And you didn't think to mention that in your profile?" "It's not exactly something the consortium system has a checkbox for." I almost laughed. "Almost. Jared, I need to tell you something." "All right. I'm also gay," I said. "And I have spent the last 4 days being profoundly disturbed by the idea of being auctioned as a surrogate. And I came to this meeting genuinely prepared to invoke the mutual confirmation clause and end the whole thing. But you walking in here and going completely silent and then saying more real in that particular way?" I paused. "I'm curious now, which is inconvenient." He stared at me for another moment of that particular silence. Then, very slowly, something happened at the corners of his mouth that wasn't quite a smile, but was adjacent to one. "More real," he said, "because you looked at me like you had opinions about me before I'd said a single word. And that doesn't happen to me very often. People usually perform neutrality until they've assessed the situation. I wasn't performing neutrality. No, he agreed, you weren't. We sat there looking at each other across the round table in the warm consultation room, two gay men in a room designed for a very different kind of meeting, with a contract on the table between us that neither of us had entirely chosen. I would like to not invoke the confirmation clause, Jared said carefully, but I would also like to, if you're willing, have a different kind of conversation than the consortium probably intended about what this actually is, what we actually want it to be. Before either of us signs anything, that, I said, is the first thing anyone has said in this entire process that sounds like something I'd actually agree to. We spent 3 hours in that consultation room, and by the end of it, Dr. Talk. Harlow had knocked on the door twice to check whether we needed anything, in a tone that suggested she was mildly concerned we had either abandoned the process or decided to have a very extended argument. We had done neither. We had talked. Jared Charles was 32 years old. He ran a private investment management firm that he had built from a smaller company his father had left him, and he had apparently tripled its value in 4 years through a combination of genuine analytical talent and a willingness to make decisions that made people nervous until they proved correct. He lived alone in a large house on the north side of the city that he described, without apparent sentiment, as too much space for one person. He had a younger sister named Cora, who he was clearly fond of in a way he didn't entirely know how to articulate. He read more than most people I had met. He was quietly, precisely, almost painfully honest. I told him about the medical power of attorney, about Marcus and Elena and the drowning metaphor I had arrived at in my kitchen. He listened without interrupting, which, in my experience, is rarer than it should be. Your brother used a medical delegation authority to enter you into an auction for a surrogate contract, he said when I finished. Yes. And you came to this meeting prepared to cancel the contract. Yes. But you're still here. You went quiet when you saw me, I said again, and then you said something that sounded like you'd actually thought about me as a person before you walked in. That matters. He was quiet. Then, I looked at your profile for 2 hours before I decided to bid. I wasn't, the other profiles, they were comprehensive. All the relevant metrics. But yours had this single-line notation at the bottom of the personal statement section. Participation in this program is involuntary but not undertaken in bad faith. I asked Dr. Doc Harlow about it, and she said your contract had been signed by a legal representative. And He stopped, looked at his hands briefly. I was going to withdraw my bid. It felt wrong, knowing you hadn't chosen this directly. But you didn't withdraw. No, because the line, not undertaken in bad faith, you had found a way to mean it. That's not nothing. I was very still for a moment. You bid $47,000 because of 8 words I wrote in a profile box. 10 words technically, and the bidding had already reached $32,000 from another client. I would have gone higher. I looked at him. He looked back. The fountain outside continued, faithful and decorative, not caring at all about any of this. I want to be clear about what this arrangement would mean, I said eventually. I would be carrying a child. That is not an abstraction. That is 9 months of my life and a physical experience of very significant magnitude, and a process at the end of which there is a person who is, depending on the genetics, going to share some portion of my biology. Yes. And then that child would go to you. Yes. That is what the contract specifies. I nodded. I need to know, not for the consortium's benefit, but for mine, that you're going to be a good father. Jared was very quiet. It was a different kind of quiet from the one at the door, not surprised, not processing, but something more careful. I can tell you, he said finally, that I have spent more time thinking about what kind of father I want to be than I have spent on almost anything else in my life. I can tell you that I am terrified of getting it wrong. I can tell you that I believe that terror, that specific kind of terror, is probably the right feeling to have about it. Whether that constitutes being a good father, I don't know. I can only tell you that I will try with everything I have. The honest answer, when you are expecting qualifications and deflections, has a particular force. All right, I said. All right? All right, I'll sign the contract, but I want something added. He straightened slightly. What? I want a clause that allows us to communicate, not through the consortium's facilitated channels with the coordinator as a buffer, directly. I want your number. I want to be able to call you if something happens or if I have questions. Or if I am having a genuinely bad night and I need someone who has some investment in the outcome of this to talk to. Something shifted in his face. The consortium will probably flag that as outside standard protocol. I know, I'm asking anyway. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and set a business card on the table between us. Plain white card, dark ink. His name, his number, his email. The clause will take a day to draft, he said, but consider that a good faith gesture in the meantime. I picked up the card. It was slightly warm from his pocket. Good faith gesture received, I said. I think we might be able to do this. Contract was finalized 3 days later. The additional clause went in. It took some negotiation with Dr. Tucker Harlow, who found it highly irregular, and a legal consultation with someone from Jared's team who apparently specialized in exactly this kind of high-stakes personal arrangement. But it went in, and then the medical process began, which was its own particular category of surreal. There are things about the mechanics of what happens to your body in these arrangements that I will not detail exhaustively, partly for the sake of the reader's comfort and partly because it is not the part of this story that matters most. What matters is that the procedures were competently handled, that Dr. Terstai Harlow turned out to be a better person than her brisk professional manner initially suggested, and that somewhere in the 4th week after a test that I took in the consortium's sterile bathroom at 7:40 in the morning, I found out it had worked on the first attempt. I sat on the closed lid of the toilet for a full 5 minutes before I could make myself move. Then I took out my phone and scrolled to the number on the business card I had put into my contacts under simply Jared C., and I called him. It rang twice. Floyd? It worked, I said. First try. A long silence. Then, very quietly, are you all right? It was such a specific question. Not congratulations, not excitement, not the formal acknowledgement of a successful medical procedure. Just, are you all right, directed at me, acknowledging that the success was mine to process before it was anyone else's. I don't know yet, I said honestly. Ask me again in an hour. I'll call you in an hour, he said. Can I do that? Yes, I said, please. He called in exactly an hour. We talked for 40 minutes. By the end of it, I was sitting on my couch with a cup of tea, and I had not cried, and I was something that was not yet all right, but was on its way there. The weeks that followed established a rhythm that neither of us had designed, but both of us seemed to need. Jared called every few days. Sometimes it was brief. A check-in, a question about how I was feeling, an update on something he was navigating on his end. Sometimes it stretched. We talked about things that had nothing to do with the pregnancy, or the contract, or the consortium. We talked about books. He had opinions about architecture that were intense and specific in a way I found disproportionately interesting. He had been to places I wanted to go, and had descriptions of them that were better than guidebooks because they were entirely personal and sometimes unflattering. You make traveling sound like a series of productive disappointments, I told him once. That's exactly what it is, he agreed, with the warmth that had started to appear in his voice on a more regular basis, like it was no longer rationing itself. The destination is never quite what you'd built, so you end up discovering what's actually there instead, which is usually better. That's a generous interpretation of disappointment. I specialize in generous interpretations, he said. They're more useful. He came to my first proper prenatal appointment at 8 weeks. I hadn't asked him to. The clause in the contract allowed for, but did not require the alpha client to attend medical appointments. but he called the morning of and asked quietly if I would mind. I said I wouldn't mind. He showed up in the waiting room with 2 coffees, one of which was decaffeinated and had been precisely the right order for me, which meant he had paid attention to something I had mentioned in passing weeks before. The doctor was professional and comprehensive and explained everything clearly. At one point, she pointed at the ultrasound image and said something that caused Jared, beside me, to make a small sound that I had not heard from him before. Low and involuntary, not quite an exhale. I looked at his profile and saw something on his face that was too private to name, but too visible to ignore. In the car park afterward, he stood very still for a moment with his hand on the roof of his car. I stopped next to him. "You all right?" I used his question back at him deliberately. He looked at me, and his face was not composed in the way it usually was. I didn't expect— "It's very small," he said. I knew that. I knew how small it would be at this stage. But seeing it— He stopped. I didn't expect it to be that. He didn't finish the sentence. He just shook his head slightly, and for a moment he looked younger than he had in any other moment I had seen him. "Yeah," I said softly, "I know." We stood there in the car park for a minute in the particular kind of shared silence that doesn't need to be filled. Then he straightened and became composed again in the practiced way of someone who has been composed for so long, it's almost a reflex, and he said, "Can I take you to lunch?" "Yes," I said. "Somewhere with actual food. I've been craving things with texture." He laughed. A real one, unguarded, the kind I had not yet heard from him and which turned out to be entirely worth waiting for. Lunch became a pattern. Not every week, but often enough. We found a place about equidistant between my apartment and wherever he was coming from on any given occasion, a small restaurant with wide windows and a menu that changed based on what the kitchen felt like making that day, which I appreciated more than a fixed menu, because variety had become something my body campaigned for with increasing enthusiasm. Those lunches were where I started to actually know him. Not the outline. The outline had been legible from early on, from that first conversation in the consultation room, but the interior of him, the specific textures, the way he asked questions that were always about the thing underneath the thing, that never stopped at the surface. The way he was genuinely, unperformatively funny in a dry register that caught you off guard because the baseline was so serious. The slight stutter his thoughts developed when something moved him, and he was trying not to let it show. The way he watched the room when he thought I wasn't paying attention, always methodically clocking things, reassessing, recalibrating, and then the moment he registered, I was watching him do it. When the self-consciousness came in, like a light switching on, he was lonely. I recognized it because it is a specific kind of solitude that looks like self-sufficiency from the outside. The kind that has been so long practiced, it has started to be mistaken for preference. He had friends, or people who functioned in that role at formal distances. He had professional respect in such quantity that it had apparently become its own kind of isolation. He had his sister Cora, who he saw on Sundays when schedules allowed, and who I gathered was one of the only people he was genuinely unguarded with. And he had these lunches, and the calls, and the ultrasound appointments where he always showed up first, and always brought the right coffee. I was not letting myself name what was happening. I was being scrupulously practical about it. This was an arrangement. A contract with a generous additional clause. 2 gay men who had found themselves in an unusual situation and were navigating it with more care and honesty than the situation technically required. That was what this was. I said this to Delia around the 16-week mark when she came over for dinner and asked pointed questions. "That's what this is," I said, with the confidence of someone who has said something enough times that it has started to sound like it might be true. Delia had been my best friend since we were 19 and sitting next to each other in a college lecture about literary theory that neither of us had found as useful as advertised. She looked at me over her glass of wine with the expression she reserved for moments when she felt I was being comprehensively stupid. "Floyd," she said. "It's a contract," I said, "with an additional clause. Floyd. He's just— we get along. It's practical to have a good relationship with the lie-s. Floyd. You have described this man in enough detail over enough meals that I feel I know him, and the way you describe the thing he did with his face at the ultrasound had approximately the same energy as a Victorian heroine describing the love interest arriving on horseback. I opened my mouth, closed it. You like him, she said. I'm carrying his child, I said. It's not. Both things can be true. I looked at the wall for a while. The good thing about Delia is that she is patient enough to wait while you reach conclusions that take longer than they should. It's complicated, I said eventually. All the best things are, she said, and refilled her glass. I told him at 20 weeks. Not intentionally. It was not a planned declaration. It happened the way important things sometimes happen. Not at the moment you had imagined or prepared for, but in a gap between other moments when your guard is down and something true gets out. We were at the restaurant, the place with the variable menu, and we had been talking about something entirely unrelated. A documentary I had watched, a book he was reading. The particular unreasonableness of a meeting he'd had that afternoon that had achieved nothing except using up 90 minutes that could have been an email. Normal things, easy things. The kind of conversation that had stopped requiring any effort sometime around week 10 and had just become where we went, naturally, when there was space. And then there was a pause, the comfortable kind. And he was looking out the window at the street in the particular way he had when he was thinking something he wasn't quite sure how to say. And I looked at his profile, the line of his jaw, the slight furrow between his brows that appeared when he was working something out, and I thought with great clarity and considerable inconvenience that I was in love with him, not newly, not suddenly, the way you realize it's been raining for a while, not the moment it starts. You've gone quiet, he said, without turning from the window. Thinking, I said, about. I was quiet for another moment. Then, because I have never been particularly good at strategic silence when something is pressing from the inside, about the fact that I have feelings for you that are significantly outside the scope of our contract. He turned from the window. The expression on his face was one I hadn't seen before, not the composed one, not the unguarded one from the car park, something else entirely. Still, Floyd. I'm not asking you to do anything with that information, I said, with the careful tone of someone trying to be practical while actively panicking. I'm aware that there's a lot of complexity in this situation. I'm aware of that. I don't want to be dishonest with you. You've been very honest with me, consistently, and it seemed like the right. Floyd. His voice was quiet, steady. Stop. I stopped. He was looking at me with an expression that was doing something that I didn't yet have the data to interpret. I have also, he said, very carefully, as though he were placing each word down precisely, been having feelings that are outside the scope of our contract. The restaurant continued around us. Dishes arrived at other tables. Someone laughed across the room. The world did its ordinary things with no sense of occasion whatsoever. For how long? I asked. He thought about it with the seriousness he brought to everything. The consultation room, he said. When you told me you were also gay and then told me you were curious, I thought I knew then. I just didn't know what to do with it. And now? I still don't know what to do with it, he said, but I'd very much like to find out. Paranda. What we decided, practically, was this. Nothing would change until after the birth. Not because neither of us wanted it to, but because we both agreed, in the careful, honest way we had established as our mode from the beginning, that the situation was already complicated, and adding another layer of complication to a pregnancy was not in anyone's best interest. Least of all, the small person currently making increasingly emphatic demands on my ribcage. This sounds simpler in retrospect than it was to live through, because what it meant in practice was that everything continued in the same form it had taken while neither of us was saying the thing we were now both saying. The calls, the lunches, the appointments, but now with the knowledge of it layered underneath, present in every ordinary moment without being able to be acted on. It was like learning a piece of music in a different key, same notes, different everything. He was at the 20-week scan, at the 24-week, at the anatomy survey that took an hour and a half and was simultaneously tedious and extraordinary. He came with me to the natural birthing class that the consortium recommended and that I had signed up for, primarily because I intended to be as informed as possible about everything that was going to happen to my body. We sat in a circle with several other couples on a Thursday evening in a room that smelled of lavender and institutional carpet. And he listened with the focused intensity he brought to everything, while the instructor covered breathing techniques and support positions. And at one point, I turned to say something to him and found that he was already looking at me. And we both looked away again at exactly the same moment. In the car on the way home, after 5 minutes of very pointed silence, I said, "You know this is genuinely difficult." "Yes," he agreed. "I just want to acknowledge that." Acknowledged. We drove in silence for another minute. Then he said, quietly, "Floyd. Jared. I don't know how to do this slowly," he said. "I want to be clear about that. Slow is the right choice. I understand that, and I will do it because it is right. But I am not good at slow." I looked at his profile in the passing streetlights. "Neither am I," I admitted. "I am terrible at slow." "Then we'll be terrible at it together," he said. And I laughed, and the tension in the car became something less like pressure and more like warmth. At 28 weeks, I started having the dreams. Nothing alarming. The doctor was unworried, cited them as a common experience, something about the mind processing the impending change. But they were vivid in a way that left impressions. I dreamed about Jared with the kind of specificity you get when your sleeping brain is working with material it's genuinely invested in. I dreamed about his hands. He had good hands, precise and careful, and about the sound of his voice in the dark of an imagined room, and about the particular quality of him looking at me directly, which was different from how most people looked at me, because with him, it always felt like the looking was doing something, like there was actual thought behind it. I didn't tell him about the dreams. I told Delia, who told me I was hopeless, and then asked for details. What I did tell him was this. On a Wednesday evening when he called, and I was lying on my couch with a book I wasn't reading, I've been thinking about after the birth, after the contract is fulfilled. What comes next? For you, obviously, you'll have a child to raise, but for us, whatever that means. I've been thinking about it too, he said. And? A pause. I know what I want, he said. I've known for a while what I want. I'd like to discuss it with you when the time is closer. Is that acceptable? You know what you want, but you're not going to tell me. I'd like to tell you properly, he said, not over the phone. I stared at my ceiling for a moment. You're going to make me wait 4 more weeks. Closer to 6, he said, give or take. Jared Charles, I said. Floyd Grey, he said back, with that warmth in his voice that had stopped rationing itself, and I gave up and smiled at the ceiling. At 32 weeks, Jared met my brother. It was not my most carefully planned idea. Marcus had called, apologetic in the way he had been since the beginning of all this, never enough words to cover the territory, but sincerely trying, and asked if he could come over. He wanted to see how I was. He had been coming by regularly, bringing food and sitting in my kitchen with the guilty energy of someone who is perpetually aware that they owe a debt they cannot fully repay. Jared happened to have been bringing me a box of things I had asked him to pick up, specific tea, a particular brand of crackers, the latest edition of a magazine I had been reading since college, because he had started doing that, materializing with things I needed without requiring me to arrange their arrival. He had a key to my building because one day, I had been too tired to come down, and he had offered, and I had said yes before thinking too hard about it. He let himself in while Marcus was sitting at my kitchen table, and Marcus looked up, and Jared stopped, and there was a moment of social geometry that required immediate navigation. Jared, I said from my position on the couch, which was where I spent most of my time now because standing for extended periods had become a production. This is my brother Marcus. Marcus, this is Jared Charles. Marcus stood. He was my height, slightly broader, with the same gray eyes I had that went darker under stress. He looked at Jared for a moment with the complex, loaded assessment of someone who is deeply aware of everything they have caused and is now looking at the person at the center of it. Mr. Charles, he said. Jared is fine, Jared said, and set the box down and extended his hand, and Marcus shook it. And they looked at each other with the specific wariness of two people who both care about the same person from different angles. I watched this from the couch and did not say anything. Eventually, Marcus said, "My sister-in-law and I have wanted to say thank you to you and to Floyd. But Floyd has made it clear that our thanks are complicated, and I wanted to make sure we were expressing them to the right person first." "They are complicated," Jared agreed, with the precision that was characteristic of him. "I'd like to tell you that I think Floyd has handled an unchosen situation with more grace than most people would. And I'd like to tell you that if I'd known a legal delegation had been used to enter him into this program, I would have gone looking for a different path." Marcus absorbed this. "He mentioned that you didn't like the format." "No, I didn't." Another pause. Then Marcus looked at me over the back of the couch with an expression I couldn't fully decode, and then back at Jared. "Would you like coffee?" "Yes," Jared said. "Thank you." They made coffee together in my kitchen while I remained on the couch, and by the time Marcus left 2 hours later, he had explained the entire situation with Elena. And Jared had listened in the way he listened to everything, completely without judgment, and something had apparently been reached between them that was not yet friendship but was adjacent to it. Mutual respect, at minimum. The acknowledgement of shared investment. Marcus paused at the door and looked back at Jared, who had stayed. "Take care of him," he said. "I intend to," Jared said without hesitation, and Marcus nodded and left. I looked at Jared from the couch. "That was well managed," I said. "Your brother loves you," he said simply. "That's all I needed to work with." The weeks between 32 and 36 were their own particular experience of time. Days that moved slowly and then suddenly fast. My body, which had spent months adjusting to its new passenger with gradually increasing complaint, reached a point of full commitment to the enterprise that left me with very little patience for anything that wasn't comfortable. I became a person who had opinions about chairs. I had never previously had opinions about chairs. Jared started coming over more. Not every day. He had a company to run, and I had a life that needed attending to, even in reduced form. But more. He came on Tuesday and Thursday evenings and stayed long enough that it stopped being a visit and became more like a presence. He sat in the chair I had decided was the best chair, which I resented because it was my chair, and he read while I read or slept, and sometimes we talked, and sometimes we didn't. And the quality of the not talking had a texture that I could have lived inside indefinitely. He came with me to the 36-week appointment where the doctor discussed the birth plan and the likely timing and what to expect from the handover process. The consortium had a standard procedure. There was always a consortium procedure for the period immediately following the birth. A brief window for recovery. The transfer of the infant to the commissioning parent. The conclusion of the medical contract. Dr. Harlow had been clear about this timeline from the beginning. Sitting in the doctor's office, hearing it laid out in those specific, procedural terms made something hurt in a way I had not been prepared for. I didn't say anything about it in the office. I thanked the doctor, confirmed the details, scheduled the follow-up. In the car, Jared drove, and I looked out the window at the city going about its afternoon. "Floyd," he said. "I'm fine," I said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, in the careful way of someone who is not going to let something be smoothed over, "What are you not saying?" I kept looking out the window. The handover procedure. In the meeting. It was just hearing it like that. Very practical, very procedural. Yes. I know what this is. I knew from the beginning what this was. I'm not questioning the arrangement. I stopped. Tried again. 9 months is a long time to share space with someone, and then the procedure is, I made a gesture that meant all the clipboard logistics of it. I just wasn't expecting to feel that particular thing. Today. He didn't say anything immediately. He pulled the car to a stop at a red light, and then he looked over at me, and his face was doing the thing it had done in the car park at the first scan. The private thing. "Floyd," he said, I want to tell you something, and I want to be clear that it is not contingent on the contract or the arrangement or what happens in the next few weeks. Can I do that? I turned to look at him. The light was still red. Yes. I have been thinking about what I want to say properly, he said, for months, and I've been waiting because I said I would wait. But I don't want you sitting in that feeling without knowing. He stopped. The light changed and he looked back at the road and drove for a moment before speaking again. I am in love with you, he said. It was not the voice he used for careful strategic statements. It was quieter than that, more fundamental. I have been, I think. Since you picked up my card in the consultation room, and the look on your face was exactly the same as it had been when I walked in, like you had already arrived at opinions and were simply observing whether they were accurate. I've been waiting to say it properly in the right moment, and I don't think there is a right moment, so I'm saying it now in a car. Because you're feeling something difficult, and I want you to know you are not feeling it alone. I was very still. The city moved past the windows. Someone on the pavement was walking a small dog with great urgency. A cyclist threaded between lanes. The world continued, indifferent and complete. 6 more weeks, I said, or thereabouts. You said you'd tell me what you wanted when the time was closer. I told you in the car park what I wanted. I've been telling you in smaller ways for months. He glanced at me briefly. The rest of what I want to say, I will say properly. In a moment that isn't a car at a traffic light, I promise you. All right, I said. We drove the rest of the way to my apartment in a silence that was nothing like the first kind. Not the careful, provisional silence of the consultation room. Not the tense, almost said silence from the car park, but something warm and present and alive like a frequency we had both finally tuned to at the same time. He was born at 4:23 in the morning on a Saturday at the end of April, 7 pounds, 3 ounces. A full head of dark hair that the delivery nurse said was unusual in its abundance. The smallest hands I had ever seen, each one a complete and fully functional argument against the idea that some things are too small to matter. Jared was there. He had been in the waiting area, then in the room when they allowed it, then beside me in the last hour, with the exact kind of steadiness I had somehow known he would have, not performing calm. Not imposing it, just being it, available and present, and saying things quietly when I needed them, and not saying things when I didn't. At one point, I gripped his hand hard enough that I was fairly certain I did structural damage, and he did not make a sound or pull away. When the baby was placed in his arms for the first time, Jared went silent. Not the silence from the consultation room door, something entirely different. The silence of a person whose entire internal architecture has rearranged in a single moment and has not yet had time to adjust to the new layout. He stood very still holding this small, dark-haired person, and his face did things I don't have language for. And I watched him from the bed and felt the complicated alchemy of this, the grief and the rightness and the love in all its various forms, pressing up against each other in the space of a single breath. He looked up at me. His eyes were bright. "Floyd," he said. "I know," I said. He came to the bedside and sat in the chair that had been pulled close and held the baby so I could see. And we sat together in the early morning light of the hospital room, while the nurses moved quietly around us, and neither of us said anything for a long time, because there was nothing to say that was adequate. So we didn't try. The consortium's handover procedure, as outlined, was 3 days. I stayed in the hospital for 2 days of post-birth observation. Jared was there for most of both days. On the morning of the 3rd day, Dr. Harlow came with paperwork, and I signed what needed signing, and it was done. The contract concluded, the formal arrangement complete. Jared carried his son out of the hospital in a car seat that I knew he had spent 2 separate evenings researching with an intensity normally reserved for financial instruments. I went home to my apartment. I sat on my couch, the good one, the right one, and I was very quiet for a while, not sad, exactly, or not only that, something that was also enormous and real and its own kind of significant, the feeling of something completed rather than lost. I had done a large thing, my body had done a large thing, and somewhere across the city, A small person was coming home for the first time to a house that had too much space for one person but would not anymore. Delia came over that evening. She brought soup and did not ask me how I was feeling, which was the most loving choice she could have made, and we watched television and she held my hand for a while without either of us naming why. Jared texted at 9, "He's home. I think he disapproves of the bassinet. He has opinions. You may have passed those along." See, I laughed out loud, alone in my apartment, and typed back, "Give him a week and he'll change his mind. He's reasonable. Okay, how are you? Okay. Telling myself I'm fine. Okay. That's different from being fine. Okay. I know. Ask me in a week." A pause. Then, "I'm going to ask you in 2 days. Come for dinner, please." A stared at my phone for a moment. "All right," I typed, 2 days. HTS. His house was large in the way he had described, a house built for more people than were in it, with high ceilings and good bones and rooms that wanted filling. He opened the door when I rang, and we looked at each other, and neither of us said anything for a moment, and then he stepped back and let me in. The baby was asleep in a bassinet in the living room. He had apparently reconsidered his position on it, and I stood at the edge of the room and looked at him for a moment, small and dark-haired and utterly complete. "He looks like you," I said quietly. "Around the forehead." "He has your mouth," Jared said from behind me. I noticed immediately. I turned. He was watching me with that particular quality of attention, the kind that made you feel fully seen without the burden of being examined. "I promised," he said, "to say the rest of what I wanted to say properly." "Yes. I want you in my life," he said, "not as a concluded contract, not as a co-parent in a formal arrangement. I know what I want, Floyd. I want you at this table, in this house, in whatever form that takes and at whatever pace makes sense. I want your opinions and your stubbornness and the way you look at me like you've been compiling assessments. I want to know what happens next, with you." The house was quiet. The baby slept. The last of the April evening light came through the windows at a long angle. "You mentioned a table," I said. "Dinner," he said, slightly thrown. "I made dinner. There is an actual dinner." "Good," I said. "Because I haven't eaten since noon, and I have opinions about that." Something happened to his face that was warm and relieved and laughing all at once. "Sit down," he said. "Please, sit down and let me feed you dinner, and then we can talk about everything after." I sat at his table in his house that was too large for one person, and he brought food, and we ate. And we talked about everything and nothing with the ease of two people who have been building towards something for months without knowing they were building. After dinner, when the plates were cleared and the baby was beginning to make small, demanding sounds, Jared picked him up with the confident competence of someone who had already spent 2 days learning this, and sat back down at the table with him and the baby settled. I looked at the two of them. "I want that too," I said. "What you said. The table, the house, the whatever pace makes sense. I want to see who you are as a father, over time, properly. I paused. "I have been in love with you since somewhere around week 14, and I was scrupulously practical about it for months, and I'm done being scrupulously practical." "Thank God," he said. "It was very difficult," I told him. "I know. It was very difficult for me too." We looked at each other across the table in the evening light of his house, that was not too large anymore, and the baby made another small sound, and the whole evening felt like something settling into the shape it had always been trying to reach. "Can I ask you something?" I said. "Always. The first scan, in the car park. The sound you made in the doctor's office. That sound. What were you thinking?" He looked at me for a long moment. "I was thinking," he said slowly, "that everything I had told myself about what I wanted from this arrangement, the practical solution the obligation met, the family line continued. All of it had just become secondary to something I hadn't planned for at all. And the thing I hadn't planned for was that I was sitting in a doctor's office with you, and you had just..." He stopped. "You had just become real to me. The way I said in the consultation room, more real. You kept becoming more real, and I didn't know what to do with that. And now? I asked. He looked down at the baby in his arms and then back at me. Now I know exactly what to do with it. I just needed time to find out. The months that followed were not without difficulty. Nothing real ever is. There was the adjustment of him to parenthood, which he navigated with the focused intensity he brought to everything, crashing hard through the learning curve without asking for grace, but accepting it when I offered. There was the adjustment of me returning to my own life, my apartment, my routines, while also being present in the new way we were building. There was the question of Cora, his sister, who I met at 6 weeks after, a warm and perceptive woman who looked at the two of us, and then at the baby, and then at the two of us again, and said in a tone of great satisfaction, "Well, I was wondering when you'd figure this out." There was a conversation with my brother Marcus that was long overdue, in which I told him what had developed, and he sat very quietly for a while and then said, "I need you to know that I don't have the right to be happy about this." And I said, "You don't have that right, no, but you can be happy about it anyway." And he was. Elena cried, which she was somewhat prone to, but in the good way. There was the evening 9 weeks in, when the baby, his name was Oliver. Jared had chosen it, and I had said it was the right choice and meant it, was having a night that was not going well for anyone, and I was there because I was there most evenings by then. And we were both awake at 2 in the morning trying everything in the parental toolkit. And at some point, Jared set Oliver down in his bassinet and put his forehead on my shoulder in the quiet, exhausted way of someone who has used up all the words, and I put my arm around him. And Oliver, as if finally satisfied with the arrangement, went to sleep. We stood very still for a moment. "Is this the right pace?" Jared asked against my shoulder. "Yes," I said. "I think this is exactly the right pace." He lifted his head. In the dark of the nursery, his face was close, and his eyes had that specific quality they had in the car park and the consultation room and every other moment when he had looked at me and actually meant it. "Can I?" he started. "Yes," I said. He kissed me, carefully, the way he did everything that mattered, not tentative, but deliberate, like he had been thinking about the exact right way to do this and wanted to get it right. I kissed him back and thought about 10 words in a profile box, and $47,000, and a fountain in a courtyard, and all the small, ordinary, extraordinary things that had added up to this specific moment in this specific dark room. Oliver made a small sound of contentment or disapproval or something equally absolute from his bassinet. We broke apart and both looked at him. "He has opinions," I said. "He has your opinions," Jared said. That's nurture, not nature. You can't blame genetics." "I've been nurturing him for 9 weeks, Jared pointed out, with the dry humor that had become one of my favorite things about him. "I'm blaming genetics." I laughed quietly, and Oliver slept, and Jared took my hand in the dark. A year later, I moved in. It was not a dramatic announcement. It was a Tuesday evening in May. I had been spending more nights there than at my own apartment for months, and there were 2 separate mornings where I drove 20 minutes back to my place to get something I had forgotten, and each time thought with increasing clarity that this was logistically absurd. I told Jared this during dinner. "You should just live here," he said, in the same tone he used to say, "pass the salt." "Is that a formal request?" "It is," he said. "I am formally requesting that you live here. I will amend this to include whatever terms you require." "No terms," I said. "Just confirmation that the chair, the good chair in the living room, is mine." "I've been sitting in that chair for a year," he said. "Wrongly," I said. He conceded the chair. I moved in. It was, in the end, very simple. The house that had been too large was not too large anymore. It had Oliver in his room, growing at the extraordinary pace of small people with dark hair, and I am not taking credit for this, merely noting it. A very specific expression when things were not going to his satisfaction that Jared occasionally pointed out in my direction. It had Cora on Sundays. It had Delia for dinners that went long. It had Marcus and Elena twice a month. Elena knitting increasingly elaborate things for Oliver, while Marcus sat at the kitchen table and was carefully, genuinely grateful. And it had the two of us, in the ordinary, unspectacular, daily way of two people learning each other's rhythms and pet peeves and specific requirements and small reliabilities. The way Jared took coffee, the way I preferred silence in the mornings until I had been awake for 40 minutes. The way he reached for my hand when he was thinking something he hadn't yet put into words. The way I said things too directly and he said things too precisely, and we had learned to translate for each other so fluently that it had started to feel native. It was not the story I'd expected to be living. A gavel coming down, a number assigned to my body, two gay men in a room designed for a very different kind of meeting. None of that was a beginning I would have written for myself. But the thing about unchosen beginnings is that they are still beginnings. You can still choose what to build from them. I had built this. We had built this. From $47,000 and 10 words in a profile box and a silence in a doorway that meant, before either of us knew how to say it, that something real was already happening. Oliver said his first word at 11 months. It was not the word Jared was campaigning for. He had been quietly running a very strategic vocabulary introduction program for weeks, reading aloud in a particular order that he absolutely denied was deliberate. It was also not the word I had expected, which was something simple and direct like the words of people who have opinions. It was the word more. See. He said it in the kitchen, holding his cup, looking between us with absolute certainty about what he wanted. Jared looked at me. I looked at Jared. Oliver said it again with added emphasis because he was not a person who repeated himself without a reason. More. All right, I said to Oliver, refilling the cup. And then I looked at Jared, who was looking at me with that thing on his face, that specific quality that I had loved since long before I named it. All right, I said again, softer, to him. His smile was the unguarded one, the kind I had been in love with from the first time I heard the laugh that preceded it. More, he agreed, and we were. If you made it to the end, you're my kind of person. Leave a subscribe. Comment down your favorite part of the story, and if you want early access to videos, exclusive content, or just want to support the channel, make sure to join our Patreon. Link is in the description. Even one member genuinely means the world to me. See you in the next one.